How to sew the thread spool blocks with Amber Makes. This is part of the Sampler Quilt Block of the Month. It's available in 2 colourways, China Blues and Country Garden. Follow me and I'll show you how to make all 3 thread spool blocks. Cutting out. Take the panel that's in your kit and give it a press. This is the Country Garden colourway. It doesn't matter whether you're making Country Garden or China Blues. They're made in exactly the same way. The prints are the same, they're just different colours. So you can see all of these pieces are labelled fabric 7, fabric 5, fabric 6, all of the different numbers. The name of the piece is on above each one, and it's important that you remember which is the top and which is the side, just for cutting out. You'll also have a piece of plain fabric. So cut out all of the fabric pieces. You can cut them just around the edge and keep the label on them for now, because you're going to then cut them into smaller pieces following the instructions. In the cutting instructions, it explains what the piece sizes are and how to cut them out. And I keep the label at the top because then you can cut across the width of the pieces. It makes more sense when you're cutting out if you cut strips across the width. So here's all the pieces. Because I'm going to be cutting them into smaller pieces later, it's okay to leave the white fabric around the edge and do keep the label on top. So once you've cut them out, then you can follow the cutting instructions and it will tell you what pieces to cut. Now you can write the names of them on a small scrap of paper. I've printed mine out just so that it's easier for you to see. But it's really important to label them so that when you're constructing the blocks, you know which is which. Once you've cut all of the individual fabrics, you can see here I've cut them all, then put them into stacks so that you've got 1 stack for the large thread spool block, 1 for the twisted thread spool and 1 for the thread spool stack. And the reason for that is you're going to make 1 block at a time, so it's a lot easier if you put them into the 3 piles and then just take the pile you need, and it gets less complicated. But I would recommend that you do label them all just so that you remember when you come to assembly it's a lot quicker and easier. So there's lots of different fabrics in this, there's lots of different prints and pieces, so it's worth taking the time to get it all sorted out now and place them into piles. And if you mix them up at all, it won't matter because you've labelled them so you can sort them out later. But in the instructions, when you come to use the pieces, it will say what pieces to use, which have got exactly the same labels as the cutting. And then cut the background fabric like this into the pieces, and again, put those into the piles so that every pile has all the print fabrics and all the background fabrics. Now you can either clip them together or pin them. I clip them if I've got lots of them and pin them in if I've just got a few. And then there's the final one, so that's the large thread spool block with all the background fabric cut out. And I've now got 3 piles, so I can start sewing my blocks together. How to snowball a corner. This method is used throughout the block, so I'm going to show you the technique here. Now take the larger piece of fabric, this will all be listed in the instructions, and the smaller piece of fabric. Draw a diagonal line on the smaller piece of fabric and place it in the corner as detailed in the instructions, with the diagonal line facing the way that it says in the instructions. Make sure the raw edges are matching up on the side and the bottom, and then pin it into place. If you pin it either side of the line, you don't need to remove the pins while you're sewing, because snowballing a corner is basically cutting off a corner. Sew along that line and it will look like this. So you've got the square sewn to a larger rectangle. Press to set the seam and then fold that corner over so it meets the corner of the 2 fabrics, and that just pulls it into shape in case you haven't sewn exactly accurately. Now open it up and trim off just the seam allowance, so you're only trimming off through the 2 fabric layers. Then press it back into place. And you've now snowballed a corner, which means you've cut off a corner with a piece of fabric without having to use fiddly triangles, and it's a nice, neat finish. The large thread spool block, we'll make that first, and we're going to start by making the spool ends and the body. So take all the pieces that you've labelled for the large thread spool block, lay them out, and then you can use them 1 piece at a time. So we're going to start off by making the spool ends. So take 1 of the spool end pieces and 2 of the spool end corners. Now we're going to snowball these. I showed you how to do that in the previous video, but in the instructions it will tell you where to place them. So just to show you again, if you draw a diagonal line on the wrong side of your background fabric, obviously the background fabric doesn't have a right or wrong side because this is plain, but if you're doing it in any other fabric, right, draw it on the wrong side and start off by placing one of the corner squares in the bottom left corner and one in the bottom right, making sure that the diagonal lines are facing in these directions. There's a diagram for this in the instructions. Sew along the lines, trim the seam allowance to snowball the corner, and that's the top spool end. To make the bottom spool end, take another spool end and the last two spool end corners and snowball this time the top left and the top right. Just pin those squares into place to keep them still while you're sewing, and then take the other corner square, I've already drawn the line on that, and pin that into place in the top right corner. And again, there's a diagram in the instructions which shows these corners, so it might be just easier to follow that to make sure you've got them facing the right way. Press them, trim the seam allowance, and that completes the top and the bottom spool ends. To make the spool body, take all the spool body strips. So you've got spool body 1, spool body 2, spool body 3 and spool body 4. And we're going to just sew these together in a row. So 1 is sewn above 2, so pin it together, making sure the raw edges match. They're cut to exactly the same size. But pin them together and sew, and then when you've sewn number 1 to number 2, sew 2 to 3 and then sew 3 to 4. Once you've done that, it will look like this, and I've pressed all my seam allowances downwards just to make it flatter. And the next thing you need to do is put the spool body sides on. So there are 2 of these. Place one on the right and one on the left, and then place them right sides facing, but flip it over so that you're sewing from the side that has the seams. This means that you can make sure that when you sew over those seams that they stay pressed over, because if you sew with the background fabric on top, then it's quite easy to get the seams twisted. Make sure those raw edges are matching by pulling it a little bit at either end, and then just pin it in the centre, and that will hold the seam allowance flat. So sew that one into place, and then repeat that to sew the other spool body side into place. Once you've done that, I've pressed my seams outwards. You can press them open if you like, and that completes the spool body. Assembling the block. We can now take all the pieces we made and assemble the block. So take the top spool end and sew it to the top of the spool body. Place it right sides facing, and making sure the raw edges match up, pin it together. Now to make sure that the seam of the top spool end matches, push a pin through 1/4 of an inch down, actually through the seam on the top spool end, and then make sure it comes out through the seam below on the spool body. You can just move it slightly, push the pin all the way through, and then take another pin and place that diagonally through, and that will hold that in place so you know it matches exactly. And then do that on the other end. So push a pin through the seam on the top, pull it apart slightly, and then make sure that pin comes through the seam below. Push the pin all the way through to make sure those seams match exactly, and then place a diagonal pin through, and that will hold that seam together. You can then pin the raw edges on the sides and in the centre as well. And then this will help to make sure those seams match. You'll get a neater finish if those 2 seams match. It doesn't matter if they don't match exactly, but it will help. And then pin the bottom spool end on exactly the same way, remembering to use those placement pins. And now we've got the top spool end and the bottom spool end attached to the spool body. I've pressed my seams outwards. You can press them open, but I think that gives a flat finish. And then finally, take the 2 side borders, and these are sewn to either side to complete the block. So place one side border right sides facing. No seam matching this time because it's just a plain strip, but turn it over so that you've got the piece with all the majority of the seams. So obviously this is the block and the body and the ends, and then that can make sure that all of those seams that you've already pressed over either open or to one side stay like that. So pin it together either end first so you make sure it matches up, and then pop a pin in the centre, and then usually I like to place a pin where the seams are. That just helps to hold them flat while I'm sewing. but just make sure that it's nice and even, and then sew it together, and then sew the other side border on in exactly the same way. Again, pinning it from this side, and then give it a good press. I've pressed those seams over to one side, and your large thread spool block is now finished. Now we're going to make the thread spool stack block. We'll start by making the thread spool. So there are 3 of these. So take all of the pieces that you've cut and you placed in a pile earlier for the thread spool stack block. And I'm sorting these out here so that you can see those are the pieces for the top spool, those are for the left, those are for the right, and the side bodies and the corners. These are the background fabric pieces that you'll use when you're joining the blocks together and for going around the borders. And you've also got some little corner blocks that go right in the corners of the borders. So we'll put those all into one side. I'm going to start by making the top spool. Now you'll notice as you're doing this that these little spools are made in exactly the same way as the large spool, which is why it's a good idea if you started by making the large spool, because then you've practiced the method and it's exactly the same. So take the spool ends, so you've got the top spool ends, there are 2 of them, and you need to snowball the corners. There's a diagram in the instructions that shows you where the diagonal lines need to go when you're snowballing the corners. And I'm also showing you here. So draw your diagonal line following the diagram. You can see there, look, I've done it the wrong way. So just always double check against the video and the diagram to make sure that you draw that diagonal line and place it on top in the right way. You can draw the diagonal lines on the squares before you put them on, or you can put them on place and then sew them on. So exactly the same way, draw your diagonal lines and place the squares in place. So the top spool end has the bottom corners snowballed and the bottom spool end has the top spool ends snowballed. Once you've done that, it will look like this. So there's the top spool end, so you can see the bottoms are snowballed, and there's the bottom spool end. I'll just turn that round and you can see the tops are done, just like you did with the large thread spool. So now we're going to make the spool body. Put those in order. There are only 3 pieces for the spool body for these little ones, whereas we had 4 for the bigger one. Again, sew them together, one below the other, in order of 1, 2, 3, because we've designed them so that the prints will go like that. You can swap them around if you like. I've pressed my seams downwards. And then to finish off this spool body, you need to put the spool body sides on. So these are sewn either side of the block. So place the side on, right sides facing, and then turn it over and sew it into place from the seamed side, so from the spool body side. And then that means that those seams that you've either pressed open or to one side will stay like that. So press those into place, and that's the spool body finished. So you now need to sew the spool ends on. So place the top one at the top and the bottom one at the bottom. Turn it right sides over, and just like we did with the large thread spool, push a pin through the seam 1/4 of an inch from the top. Make sure it comes out exactly through the seam below, and then place a diagonal pin to hold them together. Repeat that on the other side. You don't have to take the time to do this. You can just place them, the 2 pieces right sides facing, and sew them together. They should meet exactly, but this is just a way of guaranteeing it, so that if you want to take the time to get the neater finish, then do this, but otherwise just sew them together. So once you've pinned it into place, sew the top spool end, and then repeat that process to sew the bottom spool end in place. And once that's done, that's the top spool finished. Now repeat this process to make the left spool and the right spool. They're made in exactly the same way, but using the fabrics, obviously, that you've labelled that are relevant to each piece. And now your 3 thread spools are finished. Assembling the block. So we're going to start by making the top row. So take the 2 side panel pieces and then place them, so you've got the side panel, then the top spool and then the side panel, and then sew them together. There's a diagram in the instructions that shows you how these are arranged, so it might be easier to just follow that to make sure you've got them in the right order. So pin them. You haven't got any seams to match, so just make sure the raw edges are matching and pin them together. And sew one side panel to the left of the top spool and sew the other side panel to the right of the top spool. They're exactly the same size, so they will match nicely. Press the seams either open or to one side, and that's the top row finished. So to make the bottom row, sew these pieces together in the following order. You'll have left spool, centre panel and then right spool. So the centre panel is cut from the background fabric. So take the label off and then sew these three together. Again, right sides facing, and put the spool uppermost as it has all the seams, and then that will help to make sure that they lie to the side that you've pressed them. And then press the seams. I've pressed these inwards, and that completes the bottom row. Then you need to join the top row above the bottom row. There's no actual seam matching to do here because the top row is offset. It's in the centre of the bottom of the spools in the bottom row. So just sew it together. So make sure you pin either end so the ends match, and then just pull it slightly and pop a pin in the centre, and then it will be evenly pinned. Because you've got some seams that are underneath, I like to pin these to hold them in the place, the direction that I've pressed them, and that just stops them twisting as you're sewing, because you can see the top seams, but if you pin the bottom seams, it just helps keep them in place. And then sew the top row to the bottom row. And I press that seam open. Now take one of the border pieces, there are 4 of these, take one of these and sew it to the top and one to the bottom. So I've just taken 2 here, the other 2 will be used for the sides in a moment. So sew one to the top, again, no seam matching, place it right sides facing, and then again sew the other border to the bottom, right sides facing, but do so with the spools uppermost because of the seams. And then it will look like this. I've pressed those seams over to one side. Now to make the side borders, you need to sew the corners on. So take one side border and sew corner A to the top and corner B to the bottom. So just place them right sides facing like this and sew them into place. So A on the top, B on the bottom. If you mix these up, it doesn't really matter. This is just the order I've done them in, but you can move them around because all the 4 corners are exactly the same size. So with the right hand side border, I've sewn C to the top and I've sewn D to the bottom. Now once that's done and you've made your side borders, you can sew these to the sides of the block. Take a little bit of time here to match up the seams. So the seams where you've joined the corners, match those up to the top and the bottom borders. Again, you can use the method of pushing the pin vertically through to make sure they go through, or if you've pressed your seams in opposite directions, you can nest them. But just pin them together at these seams to make sure it matches up. And then pin together along. It's up to you which you have uppermost as the seams on both pieces, and then sew the right side border to the right hand side in exactly the same way. And now your thread spool stack block is all finished. Now we're going to make the Twisted Thread Spools block. We'll start by making the thread spools. So take all the pieces that you've cut for the Twisted Thread Spools block and organise them into piles so that you've got all the pieces for spool A, spool B, spool C and spool D in separate piles, because we're going to make those one at a time. And then all the background fabric pieces that are for the corners, the sides and also the borders of the block, put those into separate piles. It just helps so you don't get anything mixed up. So we're going to start by making spool A, so put all of the other pieces to one side. So just like we did with the other thread spool blocks, we're going to make the spool ends first. Now these are made in a slightly different way, just so that we can make the spools square. So the corners of the thread spool ends go right across the corner rather than just part of the corner, but it's still the snowballing method. So take these corner squares, so the spool end corners, and draw a diagonal line. You can do this all 4 at once because you've got 2 for the top spool end and 2 for the bottom. So do all 4 at once, and then take the spool ends and you can pin them into place to snowball the corners. So you need to snowball the bottom left and the bottom right corners for the top spool end, and for the bottom spool end you need to snowball the top left and the top right. As you can see how I've laid this out. They're actually made in the same way, but if you do it like this, if you ever use this block again using your own fabric and you want there is a fabric direction, then you do have to do top left and bottom left, but I'm just showing you that they are actually the same when the fabric has no print direction. Next, make the spool body. There are 3 pieces for this, so just sew these one below the other in order, 1, 2 and 3, and that will make the spool body. I've pressed the seams downwards to keep them nice and flat. And then take 2 of the spool body sides. Obviously you've got more of these because you need them for the other spool, so A, B, C and D. So just take 2 of these and sew them either side. So place it right sides facing, and with the spool body piece, because that's the one with all the seams, have that uppermost. Pin together at one end and then pin together at the other end. And then you can sew that one in place and then pin this one in place. So you can see this is the same construction as the other thread spool blocks. It's just that the spool ends are different, that's the only thing. And then sew these 2 side pieces into place. And then I've pressed the seams over towards the side pieces. And now you can sew the top spool end and the bottom spool end in place. So just like we've done before, place it right sides facing, and to help make sure those seams match up, push your vertical pin through the top seam and out through the bottom seam. Those pins need to be 1/4 inch from the top because that's where you're going to be sewing, so it's important to match up the place where you'll be sewing. And then pin it together at either end. Match up this seam. You can measure and mark the 1/4 inch from the top if you want to be absolutely accurate, but I find that I can just estimate that. It's usually in about the right place. But if you haven't done this before and you want to have perfect seam matching, then measure 1/4 inch, mark it on the top seam, and then you know where to push your pin through. And then place that diagonal pin to hold those seams together. And then pin the bottom spool end into place in the same way and sew both of those in place. And now that is spool A complete. So you need to make spool B, spool C and spool D in exactly the same way. Obviously the fabric pieces are different prints for each one, so do keep them in the correct piles. Follow the diagrams that are in the instructions as well. That will show you which order the fabrics go in. So that's all your thread spools now complete. Assembling the block. Now you've made all your thread spools. Place thread spool A so that the spool ends at the top and bottom. Take a sashing strip, place that next to it, and then turn thread spool B so that the ends are on the sides. Now sew the sashing strip between them. So make sure you sew the sashing strip right sides together to join them together, and that will make the top row. To make the bottom row, take thread spool C and turn it so the spool ends are on the sides. Take one sashing strip, that's going to be sewn between this, and thread spool D, turn it so that the spool ends are at the top and bottom. So they're alternate. And then this will be the bottom row. So sew them together like this. So there's the top row with the sashing between, and I've pressed the seams over towards the sashing, and there's the bottom row. So you can see how the thread spools are twisted. So do follow the diagram in the instructions to make sure you turn them the right way around. And then to make the middle row, you need to take 2 sashing strips and a centre square. There's only one centre square, and sew that between them. So this just makes the block a little bit more interesting. We could have just done plain background fabric sashing strips that went across the centre and around all the borders, but by adding these little squares, and there are some rectangles on the border, it just adds a little bit more interest. And obviously it takes a little bit more time, but it makes your block more intricate and more attractive. So sew those together, and then that completes the middle row. Now sew the middle row below the top row. Make sure that you match those seams though in the centre. So pin together at one end, and then where that centre square is, it needs to match the sashing seam that's joining thread spool A and thread spool B. Again, use the method of pushing the pin through, or if you've pressed the seams in opposite directions, which you can do afterwards, if you haven't remembered to do it, but if you do it afterwards, then you can just nest the seams, and that's a little bit quicker. But do pin together at those seams anyway, and that will just help to get that seam matching, and it just means the centre square will actually sit right in the centre. And then you sew that into place, and when that's done, you can sew then the bottom row to the other side of the middle row. Again, make sure that those seams match up when you do it by pinning together. So you can either pin both of these rows like I have and then sew both of them, or you can sew one and then pin and sew one. So that's the top row, middle row and bottom row, and all of the thread spool blocks are joined together. So we're just going to add some borders now. So to make these a bit more interesting, take two of the borders and then a side rectangle, and sew the side rectangle between the two borders, and that's going to be the top border. And then for the bottom border, it's made in exactly the same way. Take two of the border strips and one side rectangle and sew them together, all in a row, obviously right sides facing. And then once you've sewn them, they will look like this. And then sew the top border to the top of your joined blocks. And that side rectangle meets up exactly with the sashing strip that's between thread spool block A and B. So do take the time to match up the seams either by nesting them or using the vertical pins. You can use either method. Sew those into place, and now the top border and the bottom border are sewn on. So we now need to make the side borders, and these are made in the same way, they're identical. So take two of your border strips and then you need to sew a corner square at the top, a side rectangle between the two, and a corner square at the bottom. I'll just turn these round just so they fit on, you can see them better. So you've got corner square, border, side rectangle, border, corner square. Again, there is a diagram in the instructions if you'd rather follow that, just to make sure. Sew all those pieces, right sides facing, into one long row, and then repeat that because the other side border is identical. So again, you've got corner square, border, side rectangle, border, corner square. So sew all those pieces together, and once you've done that, you can choose where you press the seams. If you want to do nesting seams, have a look at which direction your seams are already pressed in your main block and press these in the opposite direction, or you can press them open to one side, doesn't matter, and then just pin them together. But do try and make the corners match with that top seam and the rectangles match with the sashing that's going across the centre in that middle row. And then that is your block finished. So your Twisted Thread Spool block is now finished. So you've completed all 3 blocks.